This happened around 5 years ago when I went on a solo trip to a secluded cabin in the mountains. I had been planning this getaway for a while. Life had become stressful with work and personal matters, so I decided I needed some time away from the chaos. I booked a small cabin in the woods for a weekend escape. The cabin was situated far from the nearest town, and the nearest neighbor was miles away. It was the perfect place to unwind, surrounded by tall pine trees, and the only noise I expected to hear was the wind through the leaves or the occasional bird chirping. The cabin was an old log house with rustic charm. The wood smelled rich with age, and everything inside was simple but cozy. The owner of the cabin had warned me that the area could be a little spooky, especially when the weather changed. But I brushed it off, thinking to myself that it was probably just local folklore meant to add mystery to the place. On the first day, everything went as planned. I went hiking through the forest, explored nearby streams, and read books in front of the crackling fire. The weather was beautiful, and the peaceful atmosphere made it easy to forget about the world outside. That evening, after dinner, I decided to go for a short walk through the woods around the cabin. The fog had started rolling in, and the cool night air felt refreshing. As I walked, the fog became thicker, and the trees around me began to blur into shadows. There was something calming about it, but also something that felt a little unsettling. As I walked deeper into the woods, I noticed something strange. The air was almost unnervingly still. The usual sounds of crickets or animals seemed to have disappeared. It felt as though the world around me had paused. I continued walking, chalking it up to the fog, playing tricks on my mind, but then I heard something, a low whisper. My heart skipped a beat, and I stopped in my tracks. I turned around, expecting to see another hiker or perhaps someone from the cabin, but there was no one. The woods were empty. Just shadows and the faint outline of trees in the fog. "Hello?" I called out, but no answer came. I shrugged it off, thinking it might have been the wind or perhaps the sound of something shifting in the trees. I began walking back toward the cabin, but then I heard it again, a soft, almost imperceptible whisper, but this time it was closer. I spun around quickly, my heart pounding now. I could see nothing through the fog. Just endless rows of tall trees and swirling mist. I took a few steps back, and that's when I saw something. At the edge of the clearing, just beyond the reach of the fog, was a figure. It was tall, unnaturally so, and it appeared to be standing still, facing me. The figure was blurred, but I could make out a silhouette. A person, perhaps, but they were standing perfectly still, and there was something about the way they stood that seemed wrong. I called out again, "Is someone there?" But the figure didn't respond. In fact, it didn't move at all. My gut told me to get back to the cabin, and quickly. I turned on my heel and started walking briskly back, trying to ignore the nagging feeling that the figure was somehow following me. Every few steps I would glance over my shoulder, but every time there was nothing there. The fog was so thick now that I could barely see the trail, but I knew I needed to keep moving. As I approached the clearing where the cabin was supposed to be, I noticed something odd. The cabin wasn't where I expected it to be. I stopped dead in my tracks. The cabin, my cabin, was no longer there. Instead, there was a large, looming house, not a cabin at all. It was an old, decrepit mansion that seemed to have materialized out of the fog. The windows were cracked, the porch sagging, and there was a terrible sense of decay that clung to the air. I rubbed my eyes, thinking that I was just seeing things, that the fog and the eerie atmosphere were playing tricks on me. But when I blinked again, the house remained. A voice, barely audible, drifted through the fog, calling my name. It sounded familiar, too familiar. I turned around quickly, my heart now racing. The figure from earlier stood a little closer now, its shape a little clearer in the fog. It was not a person at all, but something far worse, an indistinct, shadowy form that seemed to flicker in and out of existence. It seemed to be floating just above the ground. I felt a cold chill creep down my spine. I knew I had to leave, but I couldn't take my eyes off the figure. For some reason I was rooted to the spot. It was like my body had become paralyzed with fear. Suddenly I heard a loud creak, followed by the unmistakable sound of footsteps behind me. Someone or something was walking toward me. I snapped out of my trance and began running. I didn't look back. I couldn't. I just ran as fast as I could, my footsteps pounding the ground, the sound of my breath heavy in my chest. The fog was so thick that I could barely see the trees around me, let alone anything else. I didn't know where I was going, but I knew I couldn't stay there. After what felt like an eternity, I finally stumbled out of the woods and found myself at the edge of a steep hill. In the distance, I could see the glow of headlights, car lights. I couldn't believe it. There was a road at the bottom of the hill. I ran towards it, hoping that I could find someone who could help me. The fog seemed to part slightly as I approached the road, and the lights of a car came into view. I waved my arms, trying to get their attention. A car pulled over, and the driver, a middle-aged man, looked at me in surprise. "Are you okay?" he asked, his voice thick with confusion. I nodded, breathing heavily, but I couldn't speak. I was too terrified to explain what had happened. "I'll give you a ride," he said, looking at me with concern. He told me he was the caretaker for the cabin area and had heard about the strange events that had occurred there in the past. It seemed like the old mansion had been abandoned for years and no one lived in the area anymore. When I got back to town, I couldn't stop shaking. The man dropped me off at a nearby hotel, and I spent the rest of the night trying to convince myself that it had all been a hallucination or a nightmare. But even now, years later, the memory of that figure in the house in the fog still haunts me. I never went back to that cabin again. To this day, I still don't know what I encountered out there in the woods. The more I think about it, the more I believe that some places, some things, are best left unexplored. And sometimes the fog isn't just fog, it hides things we aren't meant to see. This story is based on true events, though certain elements may have been amplified for dramatic effect. Let me know if you liked it or if you'd like more.